Good morning, and welcome to our Cyber Leaders series, where we talk to folks making the world safer and more secure in cyberspace. Today we have Israel Soong. He's the Director for East Asia and Pacific Cyber Policy for the National Security Council. NSC directors really have two jobs. Job number one is to staff the president, to get him or her anything that they need, and then also to run the interagency. And interagency is a word we use in Washington a lot, but what it really means is try to wrap your arms around the entire national security establishment and get them all rowing in the same direction, which is a big challenge. Before Israel took this job, he was the Senior Vice President for Strategy at a software company in the US and a Regional Vice President for an IT security company based in Asia and the Middle East. And that kind of experience is a huge asset for the US government to bring that talent into the government and really combine the industry knowledge with the government knowledge. He graduated from Cornell and got a JD from Harvard Law, and most importantly, he's a fellow Kennedy School alum. Very happy to have you here today.
Thank you for having me at this event, Emily, and welcome to all those viewers who are listening in. Let me also thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for just having me and all the great work that CSIS is doing to support the national security policy community across all branches of government, across all agencies. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I think we wanted to talk about cyber and Russia and China and Iran and how maybe some of the ways they use cyber are different. And I think one of the things that comes to mind when we talk about cyber is how those differences reflect how countries view themselves vis-a-vis the United States and its allies and partners and what their geopolitical objectives are. So I know we have a great conversation planned. I'll turn it back to you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you're part of this administration that has really put a lot of time and effort and resources into addressing cyber challenges, both on the home front and also abroad. We really have seen tremendous progress in the last 4 years, just in our alliances and the way we've thought about defense and the way we thought about offense. Can you talk a little bit about the Biden administration's approach to cyber policy, how they've conceptualized it, and where we're going?
One of the great things that has happened in the cyber world for this administration is the expansion of cyber into places that it didn't exist before. So for example, America in the Indo-Pacific, the region that I work in, has always had strong bilateral relationships with its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. But now this administration, in the last few years, has taken those bilateral relationships and intertwined them to form a latticework of alliances and relationships, which will really improve peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And then the third thing it's done is to take those latticework of alliances and to work cyber in each of them. The Quad, other trilateral relationships, the US, ROK, and Japan, following the trilateral Camp David Summit in August of 2023, working cyber into those relationships, producing a much stronger, much more relevant relationship to what's happening in this world because cyber is everywhere.
Mm-hmm. This, I think, has been the major change that I've seen from when I was working on these issues, years ago. There were the cyber issues that were over here, and then there were sort of the core national security issues that were over here. And now really what we're seeing is a recognition that cyber underpins so much of what we do economically, national security-wise, the communications we have to have with our closest allies and partners. And so it has been really brought in from the very beginning, and that's great to see.
It's amazing to see this transformation of cyber from being just kind of an issue that maybe should be included, people feel like, in these regional and bilateral and these alliance partnership discussions, to see it become front and center, one of the most important issues and one of the most important things that we can do to build better alliances with other countries in the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, it's really good to see.
No longer the cyber pixie dust sprinkled on top of the policy, but it's baked in from the very beginning. So there's still a lot more that needs to be done. My group here is working on a big project, Cyber Playbook, where we're looking at how the US, Russia, China, and Iran fight in the cyber domain, seeing how they all match up. We ran a series of war games that were really interesting and enlightening, also a little terrifying. And we're going to have a set of recommendations for how to fully integrate cyber into the way that the US formulates its foreign policy. And that's going to get us somewhat closer to the way that China or Russia think about cyber. They really do bake it in from the very beginning, and they put a heavy emphasis on what they think of as information warfare writ large. So we've made great progress. We have more room to grow. So I would ask you, what would be your advice for You, future you, or whoever has your job after you?
You know, we've made great progress in cyber, but our work isn't done yet. There's so many more things that we are rising to the challenge to meet. A couple of those things are some of these ideas that we really want to bake into the private sector. So the private sector in the US is one of the great advantages we have when it comes to cybersecurity. Some of these ideas like secure by design, zero trust architecture, some of the ideas like cyber trust mark, IoT labeling, which is the idea that when consumers buy a software or an IoT device, there should be a label on it that says you can trust the supply chain that produced this device. All of the people involved in making this device are trusted vendors. And so there's ideas that we're pushing. They've gained widespread acceptance, but one point is making sure that we have all of the private sector heavily engaged on these topics and willing to push those ideas out. And very importantly, international governments and international private enterprise also adopting those ideas.
Yep.
Another thing that we are rising to the challenge of is workforce development. Every year, 500,000 cybersecurity jobs go unfilled. So if we want to get serious about cybersecurity, both US and its allies and partners, we really need to grow our cybersecurity workforce. We need to find more cybersecurity specialists. When you're talking about cyber and network intrusions, think about bad guys. They can try many times to get into a network, but they only have to succeed once. For network defenders, they have to be successful every single time. And if you want a good network defense, it means cybersecurity specialists. And if you want cybersecurity specialists, we need to grow our workforce for the future. That's a long-term goal. That's not going to happen right away, but we need more young people, more talented young people to take cybersecurity jobs and to do them well so we can have a good network defense.
Yeah, let's pull on a couple of those threads. This idea of secure by design, I love it. And it seems so obvious when you compare it to other industries. Like, you wouldn't get on an airplane that you didn't think had been approved by the FAA. You wouldn't get in an elevator that didn't have the little certificate that said it had been inspected. And the idea that we need to be building security in from the ground up in these software systems, that it shouldn't be well, let's make it now and let's patch it later. Like, that's not the right approach.
You're not allowed to sell a car without seatbelts.
Right, exactly.
So the software that we buy and incorporate into our daily life should have some kind of assurance that the security was baked in right from the very beginning. You're 100% right.
Yeah, I think that there's been a grudging acceptance on the part of industry that is the direction that we need to head, and that everybody should be on a level playing field there, and that's good. That's progress.
It's hard to do, but it's something we need to do.
It's something we need to do. It's too big of a portion of our daily lives to not do it. This idea, too, that the attackers only have to get in once, but the defenders have to be right every time. One thing that we talk a lot about here at CSIS, and especially in regard to the fighting in Ukraine, is just how resilient the Ukrainian government has been, and that's because they recognize what they're up against, and they have built redundant systems and recoverable systems. So, trying to think about total defense is not realistic, but thinking about failing and recovering quickly, that is realistic. And that's something that we see folks at CISA talking a lot about. We see folks at the National Security Council talking a lot about. How are you sort of pushing forward on that resiliency idea?
One of the ideas that we're pushing forward is you're right, this idea of cyber resilience and this idea of defense in depth.
Yeah.
Many years ago, the idea was that as long as our edge devices are all secure, then the network will be secure. But we realize that we have to factor in the fact that our attackers are increasingly getting skilled. They're becoming very good at getting into networks. So we need to defend not just the perimeter, but every part of our network. And part of cyber resilience is actually using the cloud to safeguard our most critical assets. You mentioned Russia, Ukraine. One of the really good things that happened very shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine was that together in partnership with US tech companies, we were able to encourage the Ukrainians to move a lot of their critical government services and assets to a US cloud where they would be safe. So it's no longer just, I want my network to be secure, but physically, if you have all of your critical data in an on-premises server that could be vulnerable to some kind of kinetic strike by the Russians, how secure is it really? So we're encouraging allies and partners to adopt a kind of a cloud strategy to improve cyber resilience, move those assets somewhere else so that you can still access them when you need them. And that's the message that we're also pushing among allies and partners.
Yeah, this is one of those like clutch cloud moments. I remember when cloud first started to become a thing, sitting down with one of my colleagues who understood it really well and saying, can you please explain to me why me sending all of my data somewhere else is actually more secure? And he looked at me and he went, well, math. I said, math?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, but as he got through it and explained the whole thing, I learned a lot about the way that the cloud is actually set up. And now it's a given that this is a much better way to go about storing data, protecting data, and moving it quickly if you need to, so you have backup and you have resiliency. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the talent piece, I'm glad you brought that up. We have a lot of folks come into CSIS and experience what we have here to offer, and we try to talk about how these kinds of jobs are going to be critical to the future of national security. I make a lot of pitches about how fun it is to work in the intelligence community, and if you're really into cyber offense, then this is the one place that you can do this legally and have a lot of fun doing it. What would be your advice to somebody who's looking to work in this field?
I think I've met a lot of people, young people, in undergraduate and graduate school, and they're coming from like a poli-sci background, right? A political science background. They're interested in cyber policy, but they come up to me and they say, "Well, Israel, I don't have a degree in engineering. I'm not really a technological person." And my response is, everybody needs to be a technological person.
Yeah.
Not everyone needs an engineering degree, but
right.
You need to know something about the technology that affects geopolitics, that affects the networks, the national security networks of all of our countries. You need to have some understanding of chips and how cell phones work. You need that understanding because it's influencing and affecting everything. So what I tell poli-sci majors is, you don't have to get an engineering degree, but there's plenty of resources on the web. There are plenty of cybersecurity and technology certifications that you can do. All of these universities are offering online courses. You can educate yourself, and then when you come to a job that involves cyber or other kinds of technologies, you'll be much better prepared and still have the political science, the policy angle to count on.
That's absolutely right. So I teach at Johns Hopkins, the School of Advanced International Studies, and it's part of a program that's a master's degree in strategy, cyber, and intelligence.
Right.
And the combination of those three things I think is really interesting because you need that package to think about the future of national security.
I know later we're going to talk about how technology is kind of affecting geopolitics and what a strong force it is, but I guess we'll come back to that point later on.
Yes, absolutely. Preview of coming events. So let's talk about China first. Your job right now is to focus on China and then this tech competition and the cyber issues with China. It has been really interesting through my career to see China grow from kind of a sideline cyber threat to being maybe the preeminent cyber threat that the United States and our allies are facing today. Can you talk us through how you've seen that evolution and how you see China's activity now?
It's a great question. The People's Republic of China, the PRC, remains the most active and persistent cyber threat to not only the U.S. government, but also U.S. private sector and also critical infrastructure networks. What we see, the PRC, their interests lie in mainly the use of cyber as a strategic tool for tech competition. One thing that they're doing, and they've always done, but they're getting better every day at, which is cyber espionage, to acquire on a massive scale military R&D secrets from the U.S. and its allies, and to gain a military edge in the event of future conflict. But two, also to bolster its own technology prowess through the theft of commercial R&D secrets from the competitors of PRC companies, particularly relating to cutting-edge and emerging technology, including artificial intelligence. So that, I think, your listeners and viewers know very well that China has done, and they're getting better every day at it. And that's why we're really pushing a lot of these cybersecurity standards for private industry and for critical infrastructure providers. But there's also a couple things in the cyber world that we don't see other countries do, and that's very interesting. So the one thing that we have seen them do a lot, where they have both the intent and capability to do, is to pre-position on critical infrastructure through a global network of covert cyber infrastructure. And two, extending through cyber a system of surveillance and censorship beyond its borders. So let me go back to the first point, this pre-positioning idea. Our assessment is that if the PRC believed that a conflict with the United States were imminent, it would consider aggressive cyber operations against U.S. critical infrastructure. And they've already pre-positioned on that infrastructure, meaning they've already done their reconnaissance, they know what the network looks like, and they have some kind of access that they believe could result in disrupting that. And such that disruption would be designed to deter the U.S. military action, would try to impede our decision-making, induce societal panic, and interfere with the mobilization of U.S. forces. And that threat is very, very real. Over the past year, there have been a number of cybersecurity advisories issued by the U.S., along with other Five Eyes countries, and security agencies from other allies and partners, highlighting this activity, which we call Volt Typhoon. It's PRC's state-sponsored cyber actor that specializes in pre-positioning and compromising the IT environments of a lot of these critical infrastructure networks. We're talking communications, energy, transportation systems, water, both in the United States and including, most importantly, overseas territories like Guam. And this is something that we have not seen other countries do, and remains a very, very persistent threat to the security of our critical infrastructure. So what we're doing about it is we are going out there defensively and sharing the intelligence and information with these private sector entities. We're encouraging them to upgrade their cybersecurity, harden their networks as quickly as possible. And there's a number of other measures that we're doing in conjunction with other agencies like the Department of Energy and DHS CISA and the FBI and the NSA Cybersecurity Center as well. So it's a massive interagency effort. There's one more thing, and this is the second thing that I mentioned, that Beijing conducts cyber operations designed to affect U.S. and non-U.S. citizens beyond its borders. They're targeting journalists, dissidents, human rights activists, individuals it views as threats to counter views it considers critical of CCP narratives, policies, and actions. So that's something unusual because they're using cyber as a means to extend their surveillance, their censorship, even beyond China's borders through active cyber operations. So it's troubling, and that's why the U.S. government has assessed that China is the most active, most persistent cyber threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sad, really. I mean, you go to a place where you are supposed to have personal freedoms like the United States, and yet the CCP is still reaching out a long arm to try to influence it and pressure its citizens. Yeah, I think that's a critically important point, and I think also gets to this idea that the way that China sees cyber, it's not in a bucket by itself. It is one piece of this information warfare strategy that they have overall, and it goes from putting out particular propaganda messages or using cyber to surveil or these massive infrastructure campaigns that you're talking about. It's a well-integrated whole. On the piece about the critical infrastructure and how they approach that, in a weird way, as angry as it makes me, you got to give them credit for being clever there. Because if you manage to disrupt critical infrastructure, particularly around U.S. military facilities, then it does potentially slow down mobilization. And if, God forbid, we were ever to have a hot conflict with China, it's a long way to go across an entire Pacific Ocean. And if they can slow us down by 12 hours, that actually makes a huge difference. So talk a little bit about the knock-on effects of Volt Typhoon and why we want to try to stop that in its tracks and defend ourselves better on critical infrastructure.
It actually is extremely strategic and extremely critical, and that's why we're addressing Volt Typhoon and other cyber actors and the need to buttress cybersecurity on critical infrastructure, why it's so urgent, right? So the idea is that if we can secure our critical networks, that means the U.S. military, in the event of crisis or conflict, won't face all of these obstacles when they mobilize. And that means that hopefully, if the PRC cyber actors like Volt Typhoon, if they see us harden our critical infrastructure, it will make them less likely to feel that they can impede U.S. military mobilization, which may play a role in increasing peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. I think it's destabilizing for the PRC to think that we might not be able to mobilize. I think it increases peace and stability for the PRC to realize that if our allies, particularly our treaty defense allies, are in trouble, that we can come to their aid quickly and effectively.
Yeah, deterrence only works if we can actually execute on what we've said we're going to do.
That's 100% right.
Yeah, and we have to be able to execute here. It's so important. So let's talk a little bit about that U.S. posture at home in particular. And I have a lot of sympathy for the folks who run critical infrastructure, because a lot of them are little tiny organizations. They're basically small businesses, and they don't have the resources to go up against a state actor like the PRC, who has literally millions of people and billions of dollars who can focus on just this issue alone. But it's a team sport. This is one of those moments where you have to communicate to the American people that what happens in the middle of Kansas actually really matters for what happens in the middle of China. And we are an interconnected world. So on the domestic side, we've been working hard as a government, the folks at CSIS and DHS, to try to have better information sharing, to have the things like the JCDC, or to have this outreach to critical infrastructure providers and try to bolster their security. Can you say a little bit about the administration's overarching strategy there?
Thank you. This is great. Having a strategy for defensive cybersecurity here domestically is an important step. In March 2023, this administration released the National Cybersecurity Strategy through the Office of National Cyber Director. And this document is online for your viewers and listeners. Encourage them to just go on and actually read through it. It's actually a really good read. So there are 5 pillars, right? The first pillar is defending critical infrastructure. Second pillar is disrupting and dismantling cyber threat actors. The third pillar is shaping market forces. It's about using competitive market forces to increase the security of digital ecosystems. Those concepts you raised before: secure by design, zero trust architecture. The fourth one is investing in next generation technology. That also includes workforce development. And the last one we've talked about before, which is forging international partnerships. This is about forming coalitions with like-minded nations to counter cyber threats together and increase the capacity of those partners to defend against those same threats, and then working with those countries to create secure, trustworthy supply chains for digital technology. I want to say that by and large, this is definitely the right strategy. And of course, implementation is an ongoing work, right? But this is the right direction. And so one of the things that I think your listeners might be interested in hearing is, how will this kind of evolve in the future? We have the strategy now. It's the right direction. We're firing on all cylinders. How might this strategy evolve in the future? And the one thing I want to point out is one important part of our strategy is dismantling the means by which our adversaries threaten us. So the way cyber operations work is adversary cyber operations always have to rely upon some kind of network of these internet points of presence globally that they've compromised from where they can launch their cyber espionage or malicious cyber activity. Just last Wednesday, FBI Director Chris Wray announced the takedown of a cyber infrastructure of a PRC state-sponsored hacking group called Flax Typhoon. This botnet consisted of more than 200,000 consumer and user devices that was compromised in the United States and worldwide. This botnet affected home routers, it affected IP cameras, it even affected DVRs, digital visual recorders. And then the malware that they used stitched them together into a giant network of global infrastructure. And so this takedown sends a very, very strong message. It sends a strong message that we're not going to let malicious cyber actors use these kinds of infrastructure to threaten us. And marks a major victory in protecting our critical infrastructure from cyber threats. And most importantly, this was a whole of government effort, Emily. It was led by the DOJ, the FBI, and involved the Department of Defense, U.S. Cyber Command, with support, very important support, from our close allies. It highlights our commitment to dismantling malicious cyber infrastructure globally. We're going to take every necessary step we can, including leveraging our entire cybersecurity apparatus to counter global threats that endanger our national and global security. And one thing for your viewers and listeners, we're not done yet. This is the second of these large global operations that we've done. And these operations are going to come. They're going to come quicker. They're going to come more on a massive scale. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're sending a message to not just state-sponsored malicious cyber actors, but malicious cyber actors everywhere. We're going to take down the means by which you threaten us. And that's a very, very good message.
Yep, absolutely. Bravo. Congratulations to the entire U.S. government for this massive takedown. It's really quite impressive. And leave it to China, man. They're not going to do anything small, are they? So you mentioned ONCD and the National Cyber Strategy. Just want to give a shout out to those guys for all the hard work they put into that and what a great job they did putting it together. It really does try to encompass the full range of all of the things that we're doing on the cyber front. And it's worth a read. I think it's also worth pointing out that that's a bipartisan effort, that they stood on the shoulders of administrations before them to create what they did. And that we all agree, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, that pushing forward on cybersecurity at home is critically important, and that pushing back on actors like China that seek to infiltrate our infrastructure and perhaps weaken us at home is also critically important and urgent. We're getting there. We're getting there. So let's shift for a second and talk about the big technology race. You had a great line in one of your previous public comments where you talked about that technology runs like a deep ocean current between the entire competition between us and China. So talk a little bit about that and how this race in the technology space really informs everything else that we're doing. And specifically, how do you figure out which of these multitude of technologies actually are going to make a difference?
Wow, such a great question, Emily. Such a hard question,
We only
too.
do easy questions here.
So, obviously, right, we're in a tech competition with the PRC. It's a strategic competition. I did give a talk you referenced earlier before about how geopolitics is almost like the waves that we see on the surface of the ocean. Geopolitics goes up, goes down, relations change, we have crises, and there's all that going on. But deep underneath those surface currents is this deep ocean current underneath the waves. And that's really the intersection between technology, particularly emerging technology, and geopolitics. So I think most of your viewers already understand a lot about the chips. There was a book written called Chip Wars talking about the battle to control the technology between ever more advanced technology chips, especially the chips that power AI, which is the next future. You asked about what technologies are most critical. Cyber is still a critical technology, but it's a mature technology. We've seen what it can do. We know what it can do, but there's this frontier that we probably aren't sure of what it can do, which is what if we combine cyber with AI, and what would happen there? Putting aside just AI just as an emerging technology by itself, what happens if we combine some of these technologies? Another technology really isn't a technology, but it's the use of data. How much data we collect, how accessible is it? What are the rules governing its usage? And how data gets used? I think more and more of this world is being dominated by this question of data. Mm-hmm. And so the more massively that we collect data from all kinds of devices, including future Internet of Things devices, the more we'll be faced with questions of how is data used for geopolitical ends? Mm-hmm. And that's an immense question that will take far more time than we have here. Your last question is, how do we know that we're ahead? That is such a hard question. We can measure the nanometers, the thickness of the chips that we produce. We can measure how much data center usage we have for AI. These are really, really hard things to do. But I want to say there is no doubt that in the tech competition, regardless of whether it's a PRC or other countries, the United States needs to stay ahead. Yeah. It needs to stay ahead because our foundational values, our democratic values, individual freedom, dignity, respect for human rights, these things are all put at risk if we fall behind the tech competition. If suddenly all the tech that we use in our democratic society becomes tech from countries that don't share our values, I think the ramifications will be very, very big, be very, very significant. So the one thing that I'm fond of saying to audiences is tech isn't just tech. Tech does have values in it. And the choice of what values you put in your tech reflect the values you bring to technological innovation. As Americans, as the US and its allies and partners, we want the tech that's used in our societies to be tech that embodies the same values that we embrace in every other societal sphere.
Yeah, we're going to talk about China's goals in reshaping the global world order in just a second, but you're absolutely right on that, and the connections between the two. I was down at Wofford University for a couple days giving a keynote address, and one of the things that I really tried to drive home to the audience is that China wants to create a world where Huawei is safe, but you and your data is not. And that's really what it comes down to. Like the way that they look at the world and the way that they look at data, it's how can I take from you to make myself stronger? It's not what I think of as the US approach, which is how can we take all of this talent and all of this information and work together to make us all stronger?
You mentioned China, and I think that's absolutely right. Xi Jinping envisions China as the preeminent power in East Asia and as a leading power on the world stage. You have the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. They want to preempt challenges to its reputation and legitimacy. They want to undermine U.S. influence, and they want to drive wedges between Washington and its partners. And most importantly, they want to foster global norms that favor its authoritarian system. And that kind of effort is directly contrary to the individual freedoms rules-based order that the United States and Europe, its Western allies, and its allies in the Indo-Pacific have carefully constructed over the last 50 years. They want to undermine that order and to say, hey, that's not the order that we want. We want an order where authoritarian values more dominate. And so when we see them use cyber, other kinds of emerging technology, it's not surprising that, as I said before, technology isn't value neutral and embodies the values that you put in it. So not surprisingly, a lot of the tech that we see come out of China doesn't have the same values that tech has produced in the United States.
Mm-hmm. This is where I give my speech about TikTok and and about how TikTok is fun and it's mindless and it's entertaining, but it also is a direct line from Chinese government interests into the pockets of billions of people. It's a way for them to shape the narrative that you see on a daily basis. If you want to, say, do a search on TikTok about what happened in Tiananmen Square, you're going to find out exactly nothing. If you want to look at Chinese repressive techniques against the Uyghurs, you're going to find absolutely nothing. It is fun and it is entertaining, but it is also dangerous. And I think about things because, as a former intelligence officer, you have to think about the worst case scenarios. You think about a time when perhaps there is an actual shooting war over Taiwan, and what does China do but push images out on TikTok that they want the world to see as opposed to what's actually happening on the ground. And you just have to be aware of how that kind of technological capability is really affecting the way that you see the world and the lens that you're seeing it through. We were down in Australia earlier this year meeting with our partners down there, and one thing that they saw was that China was not only doing the same things it's doing here, we're trying to get into critical infrastructure, but also talking to student populations and putting a lot of pressure on Chinese national students who were at university in Australia. And that was where the Australian government was like, red line, absolutely not. You cannot threaten folks who are here to study. And that's when they really started pushing back on a lot of Chinese activity. And it is, you don't want to overstate it, but it is, in fact, a different way of looking at the world. And they see the way that we look at the world as a threat, and we see the way that they look at the world as oppressive and cruel in a lot of ways. And that does filter into the technology competition as well.
Absolutely. One of the core strengths of our cybersecurity strategy, what we push forward in this tech competition, actually isn't directly related to tech at all. And this is one of the more final points that I want to make on this subject, which is, one of the core strengths that we have is not only this diplomatic outreach, the lattice work of alliances, not only the strength of our private sector, but also the democratic values that we embrace, which are really attractive. We live in a democratic society whose freedom has tremendous appeal to the rest of the world, in contrast to these autocratic closed societies, Russia, China, Iran. This makes our diplomacy and our outreach to other countries particularly effective in gathering like-minded nations to support a secure digital ecosystem. So this idea of wanting to make cyberspace safe, wanting to make it secure, wanting to make our digital ecosystem and infrastructure secure, a lot of that push is coming from this idea that we are a free society, a democratic society, an open society, in which citizens have the ability to freely express themselves without fear of harm. And that's a very, very attractive idea to many countries who are looking to the United States to say, okay, how is the United States leading in terms of building that secure future cyber world? One of the things that we're doing is we're leading a coalition to counter ransomware, cyber criminality. And for the last 3 years, the White House NSC has led a gathering of an international coalition called the Counter Ransomware Initiative. In 2 weeks, representatives from over 70 countries and international organizations are going to gather here in DC to share information, to share techniques, and to figure out what can be done better to protect our collective digital ecosystems from cybercrime. And it's a really, really powerful start. It sends a powerful message to those malicious cyber actors who are making the world unsafe for everybody, that you now have a coalition of 70 countries and intergovernment organizations who are getting together to figure out what they can do to protect their citizens against you, malicious cyber actors. And it sends a very strong message, a very positive thing. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback about it. So I think part of the strengths of our cyber strategy is it's because it's us who's doing it. We have advantages that other authoritarian countries do not when they push their cyber and tech competition.
Yep, hear, hear. So let's talk about one other big advantage that the United States has, and that is the role that industry plays in these issues. We have the let a thousand flowers bloom approach, where we have all of these folks going out and doing really amazing things. Once upon a time, so much of advancement in tech was at the behest of the government. It was the government driving R&D, it was the government funding everything. Now there's so much going on in the private sector, and the government is scrambling to keep up. So talk a little bit about, especially given your perspective as somebody who worked in industry and now is working in government, how have you seen that transition, and how do you think that government and industry could work even closer together?
What a great question. I having worked in industry before, I really got to give a shout out to all those industry colleagues from all those tech companies around the world, from like-minded countries, who are listening in to this global event, this event, and just give a shout out to them, because oftentimes, right, the private industry is actually ahead of the government in terms of addressing these threats. I can think of many U.S. industry partners who are out there who understand all the threats that we're talking about at this event and are actively countering malicious cyber actors in their own way, using the tools at their disposal. Let's not forget, the internet isn't a government-run network. The internet is a private network of ones and zeros and routers stretching all across the world, maintained by private and semi-private organizations. And a lot of times in this work, we find that private organizations are best positioned to make the changes that are for the common good, for a safer digital world. And so for those private sector, US tech company individuals who are listening in, hats off to you for doing what you do every day. The US government here at the White House NSC, we could not do what we do without our private sector partners alongside with us. I think over the last few years, engagement has been great.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things is to be able to, the US government does a lot in cyber diplomacy to convince other governments of our views and our policies to make it a safer digital world. A lot of these private tech companies, particularly the bigger ones, are in the same place to do the same kind of outreach and diplomacy to their private sector counterparts in like-minded countries, and even in countries that are not like-minded countries. So there's a potential private cyber diplomacy that is going on, but maybe could be bigger, where things like cyber trust marks, secure by design, all these other inherently secure features that we want the cyber world to embrace, that also gets pushed out by private actors as well. I think we've had so many engagements over the past year with the private sector. I think it's been a really great relationship. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about the tech competition, about our place as the United States, because we have these democratic values that are attractive. We have an enormous amount of talent coming to the United States every year. to immigrate here. We have a tremendous ecosystem that produces great companies, and we have tremendous people working in the private sector who understand the threats that we've all talked about at this event and are doing their best to make sure we counter those threats in the most effective way possible. So I know that a lot of the topics we talked about today, Emily, are just kind of heavy, right? The cyber threats, they're out there, but we have tremendous advantages as the United States, together with our allies and partners. We can rise to the challenge, we can overcome, we can win this tech competition.
Absolutely, we can win this tech competition. I would argue we probably are winning this tech competition. There's a way that, an American spirit, I think, that when faced with a challenge, we go, hold my beer. I've got that.
That's
we'll
right.
figure it out.
That's right.
And that's where I see us heading. But we do need to harness all of the talent that we have and try to cooperate. Also, a lot of the work we do here at CSIS is advising the U.S. government, giving suggestions to the U.S. government on how they can sort of smooth the way for better cooperation. Outdated rules and regulations that maybe could be reformed, or better information sharing. And this administration in particular, I think, has been very forward-leaning when it comes to information sharing with the private sector, with industry, so that they can move along faster and understand where the threats are. I'm going to take us into one more heavy topic before we wrap up too, and that is this idea of the role of industry, especially when it comes to conflict. My team, the Intelligence, National Security, and Technology team here at CSIS, are working on a project right now, just kicking it off, that we're calling No Front Lines. And that has to do with the way that industry has played a real role in conflicts like Ukraine. This is a new world of warfare. And what we've seen is that a lot of industry individuals really stepped up to go help Ukraine in its fight, which is tremendous. And at that moment, it was kind of clear cut. There was a bad guy, and then there was a good guy. There was a guy who had been invaded, and there was a guy who was the bully who was doing the invaded. Not all conflicts are going to be that clear cut. In addition, when you have all of these industry partners that are, in essence, serving to support one side in a war effort, does that make them combatants? And what are the implications of that combatantness for the host government? So, if, for example, Russia were to decide that, we'll just call them cybersecurity company A, was in fact helping out Ukraine too much in their war effort, are they now a legitimate target? And if they were to attack that company's servers inside the United States, what does that mean for the U.S. government? How do you actually respond? So I'm not going to ask you to solve that problem today in the next 15 minutes either. But if you could talk a little bit about your past life in industry and what you maybe did or didn't understand about the way that the U.S. government works, that now you're like, oh, aha, I kind of get it now. And then if you decide to go back into industry at some point in the future, what knowledge are you going to take back with you and try to share with folks who have never been in the weird world of the U.S. government?
Wow, what a great question. So first answer the question, the Ukraine example, I think we're at a new frontier in geopolitics where the distinction, it used to be a very firm distinction between private actors and government actors, state-sponsored actors. And what we're seeing in the cyber world is a steady blurring of that boundary.
Yeah.
And what are the implications of perhaps adversary countries, private enterprise acting against the United States on behalf of the state? What does it mean for U.S. companies here? Are they obliged in a similar way? Are they targeted by the adversaries in a similar way? There's a lot of legal nuances that have to be teased out about what do you do that makes you a combatant in a future cyber conflict. And that's not something that we're going to solve here. I just want to flag it for your viewers and listeners. This is something that we have to figure out. It could be a future world in which a technologically based conflict, a cyber conflict, is so severe that here in the United States, we would actually ask companies to volunteer, to step up, to defend our critical infrastructure, our telecommunication networks, to actually be part and parcel of the United States defense of the homeland. And I can see that happening in a very, very clear, stark way in the event of a crisis. But going back to your other issue, which is a little easier to address, the United States government, coming into government and working in government, you can see how difficult it is to get a policy enacted, to get all of the stakeholders, whether they're interagency or the private sector, to act together in a coordinated and coherent way that reflects the administration's priorities. So I think when I was in the private sector, I didn't have an appreciation for that.
Yeah.
But now here I work at the White House NSC, right? Just I gave a shout out to everyone in the private sector listening to this event. I also want to give a shout out to everyone that I work with in government, at the White House, at the NSC, ONCD, all the interagencies. This is a very, very tough job. There's a lot of complex and nuanced decision making that has to take place. I've learned a great appreciation for what happens here in the government, and it's been an eye-opening experience, a great experience, and a very different experience, and one that I'm immensely grateful and thankful for.
Yeah.
So,
well, they're very lucky to have you. Yeah, one of the Amazon, their sort of cultural touchstones is this idea of two-way doors and one-way doors, that you can make a decision in business that's a two-way door, and you walk through it, oh, that didn't work, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to walk back. And then there's one-way doors where you walk through it and you can't walk back. And that second category, the one-way door, is one where you have to think very carefully before you walk through it. In government, almost everything is a one-way door. The stakes are so high. And I think that people in industry, they talk a lot about being willing to embrace failure. And the government needs to be better at taking risks and embracing failure, to be sure. But you also have to remember that, as you're saying, these are nuanced problems with a lot of decision makers, and they're one-way doors. So we are really quite happy that you are in the seat that you're in and that you're putting so much careful thought into all of these things that you're working on. And thank you so much for coming in here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's great to have been here.
It's been a pleasure.